Our speaker this evening, Kristin Haas, is currently an assistant professor in the program in American Culture here at the University of Michigan, where she lectures, teaches, and writes about memory, publics, and memorialization. Prior to joining the faculty here at Michigan, Dr. Haas was the assistant director of Imagining America, Artists and Scholars in Public Life, a national consortium of colleges, universities, and cultural institutions dedicated to putting cultural work at the heart of American higher education. During the formative years of the program, Dr. Haas helped to establish the relationship with individual campuses that shaped Imagining America as a consortium. In addition to developing the broad alliance of institutions, she organized conferences and assisted in defining the vision of the organization. Though no longer on the staff of Imagining America, Dr. Haas continues to work with Imagining America as a consultant. In 1998, Kristin Haas's dissertation research, which received an honorable mention for the American Studies Association Dissertation Prize, was published as Carried to the Wall, American Memory and the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. In this compelling book, Dr. Haas examines the objects left at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial and considers the ways Americans have struggled to understand the meanings of national identity, patriotism, and community in the aftermath of a war that divided the country. In the text, she looks at the reasons behind the outpouring of objects, what she calls a strong, multivocal, contradictory, unsolicited public response that had been left at the wall since it was dedicated in 1982. The larger theses regarding the creation of public memory and cultural legacies have been consistent themes in Dr. Haas's work. Kristin Haas's current areas of research include visual culture, material culture, museum studies, and 20th century cultural history. Her courses here at Michigan frequently deal with themes regarding museums, historic sites, and public memory. In addition to her many academic commitments, Dr. Haas has worked in a number of history museums as well, including the Henry Ford Museum in Greenfield Village, and she was also a Smithsonian Fellow at the National Museum of American History. It is this latter institution that Dr. Haas will discuss this evening. Please join me in warmly welcoming Kristin Haas.
Thank you. Thanks, Brad, for inviting me, and please extend my thanks to Ray for this series and for making museum studies a part of the intellectual life of the university. I am grateful for all of your work. In this series, I'm a little bit of an outlier. I'm not really talking about a controversy. I'm not talking about my own beloved exhibition. I'm not talking about an institution that I'm building from the ground up. Although I do think of the American History Museum as a little bit of my museum. I spent time there as an intern, as a exhibit writer, and a couple of times as a fellow. I'm going to talk about a controversy that wasn't. And I promise on this beautiful evening where you all came into this room to fill the room with a little bit of light as I talk about this controversy about that wasn't. Their deaths are paraded to legitimate more deaths elsewhere, the deaths of others as innocent as themselves. And I want to start with two quick thoughts this evening. First, David Simpson, in his recent book, 9/11: Cultures of Commemoration, does a long, rather brutal reading of the Portraits of Grief, published in the New York Times in the days and months after the planes hit the Twin Towers. He notices the democratic impulse in these hypercharged obituaries. Thousands of people appear in the Times whose deaths, under other circumstances, would not have warranted space in the paper. All of those killed in New York, Washington, and Shanksville, Pennsylvania, except the perpetrators, were included in the portraits unless the families explicitly requested that they not be. And Simpson notices the personal details in each of the essays that accompany the photographs. We come to know the dead as beloved parents, as hardworking immigrants, as loving sons, and as volunteers in their community. Simpson worries that the Times profited by and therefore commodified these life summaries. But more bitingly, Simpson argues that these generically heroic obituaries were politically dangerous. The representation of the dead as icons of America, he writes, surely contributed to a largely uncritical application of a language of war. Those killed in the 9/11 attacks are figured, as Simpson reads the Times and the book that they published of these portraits, as having sacrificed for the nation. He finally accuses the Times and Howell Raines, who wrote and led the project, of implicitly generating justification for the wars that would follow the attacks. He writes, their deaths are paraded to legitimate more deaths elsewhere, the deaths of others as innocent as themselves. I think this is a tough reading of the naming of the dead. I don't like it. I find it hard to swallow, but I think it's accurate, and I think it's very important for the talk that I'm giving today. It's valuable because it speaks directly not only to a cultural compulsion to remember. As a person who studies memorial, September 12th and 13th, my phone was ringing, people saying, how are we going to remember this? But also to the particular terms of the use of memory in the U.S. in the last 20 years, and to the consequences of this use of memory. We are compelled to remember, we remember in particular terms, and that memory has consequences. The second little thought that I want to start today with is this Huey helicopter. It's a 57-foot-long Vietnam War-era Huey helicopter that sits quietly on the 3rd floor of the National Museum of American History. In the exhibit, The Price of Freedom, which is the subject of my talk today, it seems to function as a benign backdrop, a stage set for a familiar G.I. Joe action scene. But I keep asking myself, what did this helicopter do in Vietnam? Don't we, historians, museum professionals, people in the world, know that what it did was wrong, that even the architects of this war have regretted it and have confessed to misleading the public and recklessly spending American and Vietnamese lives? Doesn't it stand to reason that putting the Huey in the museum would be complicated at best? So how then did the helicopter get into the museum in an uncomplicated way as a beloved icon without controversy, or really as anything other than as an icon of gross violence? This is a photograph of, and I can't help but see this as a kind of military image of kind of landing on the beach, right, but sort of landing on the mall. This is a photograph of the Huey as it arrived to be delivered, taken apart, and taken up into the National Museum of American History and reassembled. This is a place where helicopters often land, right? People coming to and from the White House land here. But in this context, with the flags flying, the photographers gathered, the shaft of the Washington Memorial in this space that has been, particularly in recent years, fought over as a space where freedom of expression, so important, particularly in the context of protesting the Vietnam War. This photograph seems to me pretty rich. The label that accompanies the helicopter on the 3rd floor of the American History Museum reads, and listen to how the agency that the Huey is given. Nearly 4,000 Bell UH-1 Iroquois helicopters, nicknamed Hueys, served during the war. This Huey, with tail number 6510091, was deployed to Vietnam in 1966 and served with the 173rd Assault Helicopter Company, known as the Robin Hoods. It returned to the United States and continued to fly until 1995, when it was decommissioned and acquired by the Air Texas Command Museum. In 2002, 091, as it was called, became the centerpiece of a documentary film and a tour of reconciliation and remembrance that brought Vietnam veterans and their stories to people across America. This language is so neutral, the language of the text, until the last sentence, where the war machine whose whirling blades have become the soundtrack for a generation of war movies is turned over to a museum and becomes a tool of reconciliation and remembrance. And the controversy that wasn't for me is, how did this make it into the museum without people noticing? How did that happen? How did the Huey become a tool of reconciliation and remembrance? To begin to answer this question, we need to think about the terms reconciliation and remembrance through which the transformation of the Huey was achieved. The label reads that brought Vietnam veterans and their stories to people across the nation. So it's a domestic reconciliation, and what is remembered is the veteran. I want to make clear in this talk that the particular, not domestic violence implied by the object, the Huey, and the label that describes it act together to answer the question, how did the helicopter get in the museum? People in the U.S. have responded to the war by remembering, and by remembering soldiers in particular, and this memory has produced an understanding of the war that leaves behind the war itself, the consequences of the war in Vietnam, and the politics of the U.S. in the world after the war. And most pressingly, has helped to create a cultural logic about war and soldiers' bodies that is central to the waging of the war in Iraq today. The exhibit promises to use the Huey to reconcile the losses of the Vietnam War. I want to argue that the Huey on the Mall reconciles, provides a logic for, makes all right the spending of bodies in Vietnam and in American wars since. And I should say, the therapeutic function that the Huey performed for individual veterans is really important, and they're in the kind of world of trauma, Vietnam, post-traumatic stress. There's a whole incredible set of really interesting experiments that people have undertaken, and I am not arguing that work isn't important. I want to distinguish between the kind of individual therapeutic role and the national symbolic role of the Huey, and that's what I'm concerned about. So those are my two thoughts to begin with. The specific subject of my talk is the National Museum of American History's exhibit, The Price of Freedom, Americans at War. I want to argue that this exhibit enacts the use of memory I have just described, the dangerous and troubling use of memory in the U.S. in the last 20 years that privileges a preoccupation with the memory of the soldier and thus enables a kind of collective blindness to the global consequences of the work these soldiers are doing in the world. Excuse me, and I say all of this in the context of somebody who wrote a really loving book about how important it is to remember soldiers. It's important to remember soldiers. And I was just saying to Brad, the working title of my current book has been until today, Wanting Memory. And today I thought, you know, I think a better title would be Remembered to Death. And that very much kind of informs the way I'm thinking about this exhibit. The Price of Freedom, Americans at War is a permanent exhibit that opened on Veterans Day in 2004 as the first part of a major renovation of the building and the exhibits of the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History on the Mall in Washington, D.C. The museum is now closed for 2 years to undertake these, at least 2 years to undertake these renovations. The exhibit covers more than 18,000 square feet of some of the most highly charged museum real estate in the country. It's relatively familiar military history. Muskets and uniforms and broadsides and photographs. And it's divided into 9 chronological sections: independence, expansion, Civil War, World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Cold War, new roles, and this is the post-Cold War period, and a large hall of, Medal of Honor hall. My argument this evening assigns a lot, but not too much, power in the culture to the price of freedom. David Boswell begins his introduction to Representing the Nation, Histories, Heritage, and Museums with this observation. The nation-state is said to have passed its day, but nationalism seems particularly vociferous. This is one of the great paradoxes of current affairs. Why is the desire for nationalism particularly vociferous now? And why is this question relevant for museum studies? First, it's worth stating the obvious. Nations and nationalism are still both real and important, and there has been a great deal of interest among scholars in thinking beyond the nation. There has been a great deal of interest among scholars in thinking beyond the nation to the transnational, post-national, multinational, and global. This is compelling and vital work. It reflects the shifting consolidation of capital and new state formations, but the nation as a category around which millions of people continue to imagine their lives, organize their lives, and in fact sacrifice their lives is still very much alive. In fact, the idea of the nation on the ground, if you will, seems to be gaining rather than losing significance in the U.S. For this reason, it requires continued exploration. In the context of museum studies, this is particularly pressing because museums are central sites for the production of nations. This is how they came to be as institutions, and this is the power they continue to wield. Theorists of nations and nationalism seem generally to agree, with varying degrees of skepticism about the possible good in nations as political and social entities, that the story of nations and nationalism is one of the degeneration from early rational, progressive, democratic roots to the radical, murderous authoritarianism of National Socialism and post-Cold War ethnically defined nation states. Or more simply put, despite their revolutionary impulses, nations are, as they have emerged, are not rational, necessarily progressive or benign. And I'm going to talk a little bit, for a few minutes, about theories about nationalism as they play into my argument about the exhibit at the Smithsonian. Scholarly conversations about how nations are constituted and how they operate date to the 1880s. In fact, really some of the best work comes from the 1880s, but have been taken up again with great interest in the 1980s and the 1990s. There is general agreement among scholars that nations are transnational products of the late 18th century, and that they are not natural, geographical, or linguistic or ethnically defined bodies, but rather that they are social constructions that emerge from particular historical circumstances. The history of nations, as most scholars see it, and I think this is sort of good to have behind me as I'm moving through these arguments. The history of nations, as most scholars see it, is the history of the mobilization of state and economic power by shifting points of geographical, racial, ethnic, gendered, linguistic, and ideological connection. In other words, nations are constructed, they're gendered, they're racialized, and they are potentially, as we all know, dangerous. Jeff Ely and Ronald Suney, in their helpful essay titled "From the Moment of Social History to the Work of Cultural Production," trace the development of arguments about nations and nationalism over the last 100 years. They see in scholars like Benedict Anderson and Eric Hobsbawm a movement of the discussion beyond material and structural determinations into the realm of discourse and the generation of meanings, getting closer to the work of museums. Reinvention of the past is a common theme in this history of nationalism. Over and over again, theorists of nationalism come back to ultimately what nations are a set of shared ideas about the past, and the sharing is volatile. For Ely and Suney, important forms of this cultural production include literature, poetry, theater, music, opera, painting, popular festivals, national dress, institutions of learning like academies, museums, literary societies, the invention of new rituals, flags, anthems, commemorations, and most fundamentally of all, and this is not just in their work over and over again, most fundamentally of all, the production of the past. This list suggests specific forms of cultural production and a hierarchy for understanding them, emphasizing productions of the past. Building on this, Jeff Ely and Suney write, nationness, the complex, conscious, unspoken, inescapable modalities of being national, provides the generic currency of political identity formation in public and everyday conditions of life in the 20th century. Lauren Berlantz uses the more immediately accessible term national symbolic to describe the process of being national, writing the order of discursive practices whose reign within a national space produces and also refers to the law in which the accident of birth within a geographical political boundary transforms individuals into subjects of collectively held history. Berlant produces a list of discursive practices, rituals, narratives, She provides an alphabet for a collective consciousness or national subjectivity. Through her idea of the national symbolic, the historical nation aspires to achieve the inevitability of natural law or a birthright. Right? Sort of through these cultural productions, the processes of building nations become invisible. They become naturalized. Scholar after scholar has generated lists like these of cultural mechanisms, and over again, as I said before, the production of the past is emphasized. I would add to these alphabets the production of the past, and for our moment, I would add representations of the figure of the soldier. For Benedict Anderson, the compelling question, I'm almost done with this little bit on nationalism, but I feel like I have to go through it. For Benedict Anderson, the compelling question about the mystery is about the mystery of the power of inventions of the past. Ultimately, and this is a much quoted piece from Anderson, he writes, "It is this fraternity that makes it possible over the past 2 centuries for so many millions of people, not so much to kill as willingly to die for limited imaginations. These deaths bring us abruptly face to face with the central problem posed by nationalism. What makes these shrunken imaginings of recent history, right, 200 years of cobbled together stories about the past, generate such colossal sacrifices? For Anderson, these imaginings, these constructions of the past wield incredible power. This formulation has been tantalizing and fascinating to scholars for the last 20 years. And it continues to be so. Historically located, invented pasts produce nations for which millions willingly die. What makes these shrunken imaginings so potent? The history of thinking about nations quickly rehearsed here argues roughly nations are constructed, that they are constructed by cultural productions, and that these cultural productions are crucially linked to cultural practices related to the past. Symbolic forms and cultural representations are not decorative but productive, and these meaning-making practices often involve remembering. Nations are then not just constructed, but they are constructed by practices of remembering, often by practices of remembering grief, especially as associated with soldiers. All of this gives The Price of Freedom, this exhibit that I promise I will eventually get to, a pretty deep cultural charge. Cultural production about the past that constructs the past in terms of remembered grief and remembered soldiers on the National Mall, which is the symbolic core of the capital city. The context of the current memorial boom intensifies this charge, and I'm going to talk for a minute about what I call the memorial, well, me and many others call a memorial boom. We are, in this moment, in the throes of a 30-year memorial boom. There was one more earlier in the United States, not immediately following the Civil War, but starting about 10, 15 years after the Civil War. Intense interest in the past, historical museums, memory, memorials. As Andres Hussein puts it, memory has become a cultural obsession of monumental proportions across the globe. In the U.S., this is evident. The evidence of this boom is nearly everywhere. Increased interest in historical preservations of all sorts, historical sites, historical reenactments, historical markers, memorials, monuments, and of course, history museums. Why? Why has remembering the past become so vital? Because remembering the past produces the nation, right? And globalization threatens the nation. This is kind of my truncated sneaking in a little, like I don't have time to work this all out, but I think this is, I think that my reading of the exhibit will support this. Nations are under siege, hence the intensification of interest in holding on to them. A good deal of energy in the literature on memory is devoted to developing terminology and mechanisms for understanding and holding on to, however fleetingly, processes of memory. People talk about counter memory, post memory, prosthetic memory, habitual memory, narrative memory. All of these categories are useful, but they don't answer the question, why memory now? I don't have time to make a whole long argument about it, but I'm going to give you a truncated one. The current memory boom in the U.S. has a few distinct but not entirely disarticulated origins. The social movements of the 1960s, the Second World War, the Vietnam War, and again, the Second World War. And I list them in this funny order because I think that's the order in which they came to bear on the memory boom. Interest in memory emerged popularly and in the scholarship of the late 1970s. My shorthand for this is Roots, right, 1977. Scholars, genealogists, and cultural workers of all sorts turned to memory as they searched for and constructed alternative revisionist history. Memory became a key category for those who had been excluded from the historical record. Memory became a tool for rewriting the boundaries of the nation, for, if you will, getting in and getting on the record. And as a result, memory began to take on a renewed importance. Much of the debate in the culture wars of this period has been about either expanding or policing national boundaries as they are constructed by memory. The next kind of influence or push for the memory boom comes from thinking about the Holocaust. But before I get to that, in sort of going back and trying to reconstruct where did this interest in memory come from, I feel like I have to peel away the incredible impact of thinking about the Holocaust to find this other story. But I think putting this other story in context is also really important. That there were a lot of people who were interested in museums and in all different kinds of cultural institutions and individuals as well, figuring out how to get into the historical record. In the immediate post-World War II years in the US, memory held little cultural capital. We didn't have a World War II memorial because people weren't interested in memorials. They were interested in building infrastructure. They built highways. They built bridges. By the 1970s, when some of these bridges and highways began to crumble, the imperative to remember the war in the United States started to gain strength. But first, it was about remembering the Holocaust. And I think this came from a lot of different sources, came from sort of global politics, came from people in Europe starting to remember the war more, the Holocaust more powerfully. And of course, the sort of language that came to define so much of this memory boom, language about never forgetting, language about the need to remember, came from this. But in the US, there's a very particular context of the emergence, or story of the emergence of Holocaust memory. Some Hussein, this scholar that I just quoted, dates it to the airing of Holocaust, the miniseries in 1978, which I think is a good place to go. And it's also important to remember the guy who made Holocaust worked on Roots, which came 1 year before. I think they're very connected. And of course, in the same moment, plans were being made for the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. And it was so interesting in the last exhibiting controversy talk when Alice Greenwald was talking about her experience at the Holocaust Museum and then building the 9/11 Memorial Museum. And at the end, I asked her a kind of rambling set of about 18 questions. But the two main questions I was trying to get at were, can you speak about your experience designing the 9/11 Museum as distinct, can you think about it as distinct from your experience at the Holocaust Museum? And I think she was sort of pretty clear in saying, no, I can't disarticulate them. My other question for her was, can you disarticulate the Holocaust memory in general from kind of our memory now? And she gave me a really interesting answer, which she said, no, but I could talk to you about how important memory is in Jewish culture. And I thought that was a very wonderful and fascinating answer. So, Roots, Holocaust, memorials, museums, the television series, and then not the end of the Vietnam War, but the beginning of remembering the Vietnam War. The building of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, brilliantly designed, controversial, and moving, and as people who study memorials have begun to argue, started at a whole new generation of building of war memorials. Unintentionally shifted our thinking about the Vietnam War and placed this emphasis on not on the war, but on remembering the war. What's remembered at the wall, and there's a distinction. What's remembered at the wall are the soldiers who were killed, not the Vietnamese dead, not the war itself, not the political fallout of the war, just the American dead and the missing. And I've written a whole book on this, and I think it's a great memorial, and I think it does this incredible stuff, but I also think it worked too well. It shifted so powerfully the focus from thinking about how complicated the war was to thinking about those losses, that it created, I think, a kind of cultural logic for how the federal government can spend the bodies of soldiers that we are having to contend with today. And I'm going to come back to that when I get to the specifics of the exhibit. And then the fourth category, sort of pushing this museum boom, is the Second World War again. The Second World War became important to remember, I think, as politics, national politics shifted, as the imperative to remember was asserted, and as the possibility that the way we understood war would be in tragic terms became too much for a generation of memorial builders and cultural producers in Washington and beyond. The response to remembering at the wall was a desire to refigure, and I'm thinking now, of course, about the World War II Memorial, which is a very explicit response to the Vietnam War Memorial. That's not how we should remember war, and the people who built it over and over again talking about that's not how war should be remembered. Soldiers should be remembered as heroic, not as tragic. Remembering soldiers is a way of being national. Remembering in the context of Boswell's observation, this idea about parading the deaths, is also a way to hold on to the category of the nation in the face of globalization. The memory boom, all of this makes sense, but why the desire to foreground the soldier? It makes sense to me that there would be this intensification of interest in memory. I'm curious about the desire to foreground the soldier. Why the focus on the soldier rather than the war? I want to take this question back to the price of freedom. And I claimed earlier that I want to make clear in this talk that the particular violence implied by the Huey and the label describing it act together to answer my big question, how did the helicopter get in the museum? And I promise you I'm moving towards that. Given all of the symbolic weight that the price of freedom, the exhibition of the history of war on the mall in this moment, bears, given all that it bears, it seems likely that the exhibition would inspire some controversy. And it did. Some. The controversy, however, was generated not so much by the details of the content of the exhibit, but by the institutional context from which it emerged. So it wasn't the content of the exhibit, it was the context from which it emerged. It was paid for with 1/4 of an $80 million donation to the museum by real estate developer, big game hunter, and philanthropist Kenneth Baring. Baring's role at the National Museum of American History and in the production of the exhibit has generated more controversy and more interest than any other aspect of the exhibition. And you can imagine all of the jokes. What's the price of freedom? $80 million bucks. Why did Baring generate the most interest? When Baring and fellow philanthropists like Catherine Reynolds, who planned to build the Hall of Achievement, maybe the museum people remember that story, and Oprah and Bill Gates and the outrage on the part of the curators. When they decided to step in and support the kinds of exhibits they thought they should find in the American History Museum on the Mall, a lot of people took notice. Stories about them walking through, okay, thank you. Stories about them walking through these incredible exhibitions, Field to Factory telling the story of African-American migration, and A More Perfect Union telling the story of the Japanese-American internment, walking through these exhibits and saying, well, this isn't the kind of American history I want my grandkids. I would not take my grandkids here. Where's Abraham Lincoln? The anxiety on the part of people in the museum world about this kind of influence seems pretty logical. There was a time when this was how all museums were funded, right? Wealthy idealists in the US gave great sums of money to create institutions which expressed explicitly and implicitly their worldviews. But in the US, In the years since the time of the robber barons, most museums and other repositories of historical memory have come to be publicly owned and managed. And people have come to have certain expectations about who gets a voice in the museum. In history museums, it's generally been understood that professional historians would interpret the past for the public. And of course, the concern about Bering's money was that it would allow him to determine exhibition subjects and content, that it would privatize an important public institution, and that would undermine both professional historians and their versions of history. And it's important not to suggest that before him there was an ideal world in which these exhibits were publicly funded, right? People who work in museums have to go out and they have to raise money. I think what made people so anxious about Bering and Reynolds was the scale and their very explicit desire to meddle with the content. Touring American history with Spencer Crewe and Lonnie Bunch and coming out and saying, well, that's not where I want my grandkids to go, is sort of gives you a sense of the way in which they desired to meddle with the content. Yeah, so the difference with Bering was one of scale. And I think everything that people were anxious about in terms of his contribution to the National Museum of American History was pretty justified. In response to these concerns, the concerns that he would meddle too much, Bering and the exhibit's curators, the curators of the Price of Freedom, have gone to great lengths to stress that he was not involved at the level of exhibition content, that he came up with the name of the exhibit, and that he was delighted to fund a sweeping military history that had been long the dream of the museum's military historians. This seems to be true and contradictory as a closer look at the exhibit itself reveals. The title of the exhibit and the idea for the sweeping military history run roughshod over all of the wonderful detail, the nuance of the historical detail in the exhibition itself. And here is what you see as you enter. Actually, right above this, it says the Kenneth Bering Center. And here's what you see at the entry of the exhibit. Being someone who spent a lot of time recently thinking about soldiers as cannon fodder, I just can't get over this. You know, when you put this all together, you think about, right? You think about all of the details. And I can tell you that standing there, this isn't just a problem of depth and the photograph flattening it. Standing in front of it, this, you know, sort of an unsubtle message about cannon fodder. I mean, it seems like such a ridiculous, obvious thing to say, but at the same time, I just can't get over it. And of course, I can't say this in paper because it's too much, but I keep thinking, when I see this, I think about the photograph of the, from the Vietnam War, of the soldier being, of the Viet Cong, the man in the Viet Cong being shot, and the facial expression, the one eye open, and the, I mean, something about that, something about the one eye and the gun at the temple. Anyway, my argument is this exhibit makes an argument for American soldiers as both sacralized and cannon fodder, and there it is for me writ large. The Price of Freedom begins with the following language. And I should say here, when you're standing here, there's plenty of stirring patriotic music, kind of a la Ken Burns. The Price of Freedom begins with the following language. Americans have gone to war to win their independence, expand their national boundaries, define their freedoms, and defend their interests around the globe. This exhibition examines how wars have shaped the nation's history and transformed American society. It highlights the service and sacrifice of generations of American men and women. This introductory language conveys a few things immediately. How war is described, the framework offered for thinking about war, and what is significant about war in the context of this exhibition. Under the universal banner of struggles in the name of freedom that the exhibit's title implies, the wars are described as having been fought in the name of independence, expansion, and the defense of interests around the globe. Even given the formal challenges of exhibition text, this description is partial and full of historical evasion. Freedom for whom, whose freedoms are defended in the expansion of national boundaries, right? It's hard to see expansion without seeing the word genocide coming out at you from underneath it. What interests are being defined around the globe? What wars does this refer to? Where does, for instance, the Philippines fit in, the war in the Philippines? What war does this not include? Defending interests around the globe implies a kind of naturalization of global interests, and exactly how is this connected to all of this connected to the idea of freedom? Historical evasion seems necessary to support the rubric of freedom given the mixed and complicated history of U.S. wars. So Bering, he gave the money. He said, as the director of the museum said, if it hadn't been for him, we would never have created this exhibition. And he gave the name The Price of Freedom, which is incredibly important in the construction of the meaning that the exhibition makes. So that's the sort of first thing you get from this introductory language. The second is the framework offered for thinking about war, and it's a decidedly domestic one. The language is, this exhibition examines how wars have shaped the nation's history and transformed American society, right? So this is a domestic vision. One of historians writing about this wrote, the decision to focus on the war's impact in American society often has the curious effect of decentering the wars themselves. Yes, absolutely. What happens to the wars themselves? What fills that space? That comes in the last sentence of this introductory text. It highlights the service and sacrifice of generations of American men and women. Service and sacrifice. Soldiers and what they sacrificed are at the center of the history produced, not the work that the soldiers did in the world. And that's a really important distinction. This has become such common cultural coin that it may seem too obvious to bother stating. But this is not the only way that the past might be constructed, remembered, produced in the museum. It's a cultural logic that is specific to a particular time and place, right? The U.S. now. And the shorthand for me is the bumper stickers say support our troops. They don't say victory in Iraq, right? What we see is the soldier, not what they're doing in the world. Wars are fought for freedom, wars shape our history, and what's most important about war is service and sacrifice. I'm not going to walk you through the exhibit, but I'm going to talk about the narrative arc of the exhibit, the details of the text and the objects briefly, the allotment of space, which turns out to be sort of the big issue, and the argument these things make together about the history of American wars. And I'm going to do it quickly. I won't keep you too much longer. This initial text reflects the narrative arc of the exhibit. In broad strokes, it moves from the Revolutionary War to Operation Iraqi Freedom in a pretty profoundly celebratory tone. It tells stories around each of the wars. It seems always awed by the wars and drawn to tales of grit and sacrifice. It seems, this is a mixed metaphor because I don't think Ernie Pyle was a drinker, but it seems soaked in, it seems drenched in the ethos of Ernie Pyle, maybe is a better way to say what I want to say. It is much more visually stimulating than the old March of Progress film strips, but it is not always more analytically rich, which is to say that the exhibit is full of objects, images, and stories that are complicated and are presented as such, but they get lost in the power of this narrative arc. They get lost in the constant celebration of the soldier. And I think I keep talking about narrative arcs because I spent too much time looking at these triumphal arches. But this is a handout that you get as you go into the exhibit if you want to do a self-guided tour. And I show it because the action in this exhibit is around not really the Second World War, but in the GI Bill and the consequences, the post-World War, Second World War American cultural scene, and the way in which the kind of explicitly the triumph and the march of all of these soldiers conveys that. This captures visually the kind of march of progress and the narrative arc. And I think the stories about the wars before the Second World War lead up to and justify the Second World War, and the arguments about the wars, the stories that are told about the wars since, also actually refer back to this moment of glory and triumph. The exhibit seems to be missing an intermediate narrative between this great sort of arc about freedom and triumph and the particular details. It's so visually rich, and this is kind of a problem in a lot of exhibits that you go to now. It's so visually rich, you're not quite sure where to go, and you get what the big story is, and you can get the minutia, but in between, you're not quite sure where to go. There is so much to look at in this exhibit, and people who have written about it have said, you know, it's really not as bad as I thought it was going to be. Because when you get into the details, when you get away, historians, right, professionally trained historians who are going to be kind of critical of the logic of the price of freedom, the details of the history are really quite good. The word genocide is used in the context of the Indian Wars. Empire is used in the context of the Spanish-American Wars. The little bits about the particular and they're incredible objects, and they're very well written about and played with. But as I said earlier, it's very hard to put these good little pieces of scholarship into the larger framework of the exhibit. Another way that I can describe to you kind of how this big narrative arc works is to think about the allocation of space. It's troubling, and it feeds the heavy-handedness of the narrative arc. A quick list of the ways in which space is allocated in the 20th century part of the exhibit will give you a sense of the exhibit. World War I, for instance, is given precious little space. More room is given to one section of post-World War II prosperity than to all of the First World War. This makes very little sense in terms of the historical impact of the First World War, right? The Second World War. The desegregation of the armed forces is mentioned, but you really have to look for it. The internment of Japanese Americans, the subject of this incredible, huge exhibit for a long time at the National Museum of American History, gets less space than the GI Bill by at least 5 times. In fact, they're just 4 little objects, and the GI Bill gets this huge, expansive space. Not that the GI Bill is unimportant, but it's an interesting contrast. Anti-war movements appear outside of the action, sometimes in film clips, sometimes in broadsides, but they are definitely not a central part of the story. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial figures so prominently in the exhibit, it gets much more space than the Korean War, all of the Korean War, and actually you could combine the Korean War, World War I, and a couple of other elements and still not get as much space as the Vietnam Veterans Memorial gets. Not the Vietnam War, but the memorial. The Korean War gets less space than a game of how to use dice in the Revolutionary War section of the exhibit to give you a sense of how space is allocated. What emerges from this list, what can we make of this allocation of space? This exhibit is about not only the Second World War, but really about post-World War II prosperity. That's a crucial part of the narrative. The wars, as I said before it, are justified, and after it, refer back to it. In some online conversation about the exhibit, one of the curators, David Allison, described what the exhibit does in broad terms. He said, we cover 16 conflicts in American history. We put our emphasis on 4, the War of Independence, the Civil War, World War II, and Vietnam. But we include other wars, and he goes on and he has this long list, which does not include the First World War. And somebody writes to him and says, a historian of the First World War, and says, come on, how can you not include the First World War? And he says, oh, no, 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 don't worry, we include it. We have a doughboy uniform, a gas mask, and a periscope used to see from inside the trenches, all of which fits in a little case. You can imagine that the Huey gets a fair amount of space. But the way that the space for the Vietnam War is allocated is really interesting, because it gets about as much space as the Civil War, not nearly as much space as the Second World War, about as much space as the Civil War. But most of the space, and this is, you come, as you enter, you come from in here, you come around, and this is part of the section on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. there is here, if we were in the room, there's a bank of televisions which have news of the war. And then here is the Huey with the live action scene. The emphasis in this section, the Huey is huge, obviously, and the text about the Huey is about remembrance, and obviously the war memorial is about remembrance. So what you get in this huge section about the Vietnam War is remembering the Vietnam War. In fact, in that self-guided tour, I showed you the brochure, there are 4 stops. The War of Independence, the Stamp Act, the Civil War, choosing sides, World War II, becoming a soldier, right? This is the moment of the ascension of the soldier, Vietnam, remembering the lost. How did we get to the place where what we know about, what we teach, the history that we make about the Vietnam War is about remembering the loss? I hope I have filled some of that in this talk today. No wonder the war itself gets decentered, right? The Vietnam War is figured as this self-inflicted wound that in which we need to remember only in terms of the soldier. The section on, and this is where I started to think about the title for my book, which is not actually about this exhibit, Remembered to Death, because it's about this phenomenon. The section on Vietnam is not about bad federal policy or careless, illegal, heartless spending of American and Vietnamese lives. It's about the need to remember in partial, limited terms, right? It's about the need to remember American soldiers to death. The exhibit was generally received, you might be surprised to hear, with what one might call modest disinterest. It was reviewed in some newspapers. It was dutifully visited by tourists and school children without much fanfare. It did not, as other exhibits have, capture the public imagination or generate the kind of controversies that other exhibits on the mall have generated. People who came to the exhibit found not only Huey, silent, transformed war machine, to be okay, but the logic in which the Huey was placed also was okay. And if you were to exit here, you would be coming out, and right here is an enormous piece of debris from the World Trade Center. So there is a kind of explicit connection made between these kind of moments of remembering, and the piece of the World Trade Center becomes an object of memory in the context of war. Scholarly reviews ranged from the mildly dismissive to the resigned and infuriated. Beth Bailey writes very generously about the exhibit, that it was not as bad as she expected. She said it was balanced. She was frustrated, however, by the implicit focus on the impact of war on American society, because she said the wars themselves got lost. She worried that the focus was shifted away from the wars and from what they did in the world. She concluded by describing a plaque outside the exhibit which warns that graphic images in the exhibit might be disturbing to young children, and by writing, "That's true, but I was much more disturbed that the exhibit was not more disturbing." Right? There is something about making the spending of the bodies of the soldiers okay. Writing for the Journal of American History, Carol Emberton was less generous. She cut right to the chase. This celebration of the sacrifices of heroics of wartime valor comes with a high price tag. The price of freedom ignores the cost of war, both on the home front and abroad. And how, you may be asking yourself, can it manage this? She goes on. She blames the utter collapse of analysis, and she talks about the Ambrosization of American military history. Her review of the exhibit worries about the ill effects of this kind of history in wartime, and I think she's right to worry. The helicopter gets into the American History Museum on the Mall because the memory of the soldier and the losses of the soldiers have so eclipsed the way in which war is seen that the Huey, even setting aside its literal therapeutic function, becomes a symbol of remembrance and reconciliation rather than a site a machine of war or site of terror. The Price of Freedom uses the trope of the common fighting man and woman to whitewash the costs and consequences of America's wars. The exhibit uses the soldier to justify and romanticize the wars in which the U.S. has fought and is fighting. The celebration of the soldier trumps in the exhibit and beyond the desires of citizens to fight, the objectives they had had in various wars, the imperialism that complicates the emphasis on freedom, and the multiple far-reaching costs of these wars. Their deaths, we might say, are paraded to legitimate more deaths elsewhere, and the deaths of others as innocent as themselves. And I will just end by going back to the Huey out here, and then going to a different vision of the price of freedom. And this is Arlington with some freshly dug graves. So thank you for your attention. Yeah?
I have a question. It's an observation about, oh, sorry. I don't have a quick, is this on? Is it just recording? Okay. My observation is about the text of the label for the Huey, which to me sounded like it personified it, as if it turned it into a fellow soldier. And then your argument carries from there.
That's good. That's exactly right. I think that's exactly right. And in fact, I'm writing a book about how this plays out in memorials built on the mall since the Vietnam Veterans Memorial was built. And when I went into this exhibit, and when I was standing in front of the Huey, I had a kind of dizzy sensation, like, oh, this is exactly what I'm trying to get at. This is exactly what's happening with the building of the memorials, and it's happening here. The Huey becomes one of the guys, and one of the guys obscures, our emphasis on the soldier obscures what they're doing in the world. Yeah, that's a great observation.
I'm wondering, I visited the Canadian War Museum, which is a newer museum in Ottawa, last year. And I'm wondering, I see similar themes to what you've discussed here at the Smithsonian. I'm wondering in other history exhibits that you've seen regarding war, if you see this as being a trend now, or if it's most strongly felt you feel here at the Smithsonian.
That's a really good question, and I think if you were just to look at American history, you could say 10, 20 years ago, the exhibits on war were, in the 70s, the exhibit, A Nation of Nations, which was a bicentennial celebration, figured military service entirely in terms of ethnic bonding, the Italian guy getting to know the Irish guy, getting to know the Brooklyn kid, the Jewish kid from Brooklyn, and figured war in a different way in that sense, and try to think about it in kind of more expansive terms. The exhibit Field to Factory at American History used military service to talk about integration of African Americans into American culture more broadly. And of course, the big example is More Perfect Union, which is an exhibit on the internment, which was huge and complicated and figured the war and the soldier and the people in the federal government who decided to inter Japanese Americans, all in pretty, I thought, complicated, thoughtful terms. So that definitely a different kind of, representing a different kind of politics in which the soldier was still central, but the way that the soldier was understood was different. I think in other museums on the mall, I mean, one of the interesting things that's happening on the mall is there is a kind of simultaneous closing and opening, because there are other exhibits, there are other museums on the mall, the Native American Museum, the Coming African American Museum, which I imagine when they take up military subjects will take them up in different ways. And in exhibits beyond the mall on military history, I think I have seen in a few other places a similar kind of impulse, and certainly in memorials and other kinds of representations of soldiers, absolutely.
It seems that in some of what we now know about World War I, World War II, and Vietnam, there's been quite a lot that's been written and said about, and I think also displayed in museums and documentaries and things like that, about post-traumatic stress disorder coming out of Vietnam. In World War I guess it was referred to as being shell-shocked. So there's been this sort of progression of this concept that seems to have captured a lot of people's attention. That seems in marked contrast to the current situation, in which in some alternative press statements, we can get a glimpse of the fact that many of the soldiers who are returning from Iraq now are facing quite devastating, lasting effects to their emotional and psychological health. And I was just wondering if you could speak to that, those sort of historical shifts, and what you imagine the future of representation of the wars where you have been more recently involved in may hold for this aspect of the soldiers' experience in particular. That's a great set of questions. And to the last question about how this, particularly the Iraq War, you know, it depends on how it turns out. I think we may have a good guess now as how it's going to turn out. But and so far, the memorials, there are two kind of genres of memorials to Iraq. One is and there's actually one that's been built in Fort Hood, which is the American soldier holding the Iraqi child. And I've seen sort of mock-ups for others like that. And then, of course, there are all kinds of online and exhibitions that actually are like the Portraits of Grief. Faces painted, you know, there's the Women in U.S. Military Service Memorial Museum has had for the last couple of years an exhibit called Faces of the Fallen, which artists from all over the country have painted portraits of everyone who's been killed in Iraq, all the soldiers who've been killed in Iraq. So I think it's going to be kind of a combination of these two gestures, kind of both the needing to make the argument that what we're doing is right, so that the soldier holding the child, but also the continued focus on the individuals. But the problem with focusing too much on the individuals while the war is going on is it calls attention to, you know, in the way that the current administration doesn't want us to see the bodies coming back, too much focus and celebration of those who have been lost is, you know, it's going to be tricky and problematic. Although there are all kinds of, there's a lot of energy around focusing on the soldier and the faces of the soldiers. In terms of the question about post-traumatic stress and trauma, I think the way that the label about the Huey and the story about the Huey captures both this kind of national symbolic element and this actual therapeutic function, I tried to disaggregate them a little bit, and I think that was sort of useful for what I wanted to do, but I actually think collapsing them a little is also useful, because and it's interesting because the World War II veterans didn't start to have in great numbers post-traumatic symptoms until the 40th anniversaries, until all of this kind of emphasis on remembering that war pulled this stuff out of a generation that had, in many cases, pretty deeply submerged their responses to the war. So there is an increasing awareness of the damage that war does to soldiers. And that, I think, has pushed, I think it has facilitated this logic of focusing on the soldier. World War II veterans really didn't want to be seen as damaged. Vietnam veterans were less, they were so outside, they were not received in the same kind of glorified way that the World War II veterans were. So they were already seen as damaged. And the question of how damaged Iraqi war veterans are going to be understood to be is I think we'll just have to sort of watch it play out. But the recent controversy about Walter Reed and how these soldiers are being taken care of and the kind of attention that's going to their needs after they get out or when they're injured is pretty indicative, at least, of how the military is thinking about taking care of them. And also,
you know, the problem of enlistments, people aren't signing up, people aren't, you know, recruiters are struggling for obvious reasons, and so people are serving much longer than they had expected to serve, and that is going to, that's going to sort of exacerbate the problem. So I think you would think that all this attention on the soldier would help the soldiers. But in fact, the attention on the soldier comes at the moment when they're paid less, when really we're going back to a kind of 18th century mercenary model for military service. And I think that we got to this place, you know, and I didn't obviously have time to do all this, but we got to the place where there's so much emphasis on the figure of the soldier through a long process of the democratization of the military itself. When it stopped being hired guns and it started being citizens, people started paying attention to who was in the military, to the soldier in a different way. Gettysburg is the first place that bodies were buried because that's when you had a critical mass of people who were citizens, who had families, who were connected to the culture at large, who weren't sort of just the lowest, those with least power. And we are moving away from the citizen soldier model to the hired gun model. And I think you would think that the emphasis on the soldier would elevate the actual status of the soldier, but in terms of pay and in terms of the way that they're treated in the military, that doesn't seem to be the case.
How much of the interpretation and the allocation of space and particular wars is Bering's influence and impact? I mean, I think that, you know, is sort of that hanging question out there. They wanted the money. They didn't want to end up with another Enola Gay situation, so they played it really safe and, you know, maybe went more in the direction that he would have wanted than they might have.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I've tried to talk to everybody and their brother having worked there. You know, I mean, one of the things that happened is, one of the consequences of the controversy in the museum is people jump ship. I mean, there's so many curators who just left the institution because they felt like the leadership and the people who, Bering and Reynolds, were not interested in the kind of work that they did and the way that they thought about, you know, representing the past. I think the folks in military history, I think some of them were a little less resistant to Bering's vision and to the way, I mean, I had a fellowship where I compared the things that were left at the wall as a Vietnam-era collection to the Smithsonian's Vietnam-era collection. And I ended, you know, way back with the gun guide military history, you know, and after the fourth locked door, he said, you know, what do you know about guns, honey? And I thought, I know enough to know. I mean, you know, I didn't think he was going to shoot me, but I thought, okay, this is a kind of military history world that I'm not used to. You don't have to call me honey. So I think that Bering's politics may have matched more with some of the politics of some of the folks in military history, but I think the kind of exhibit that he wanted, the sweep, the emphasis on heroism, which he was very explicit about, the emphasis on freedom, didn't allow for a nuanced, kind of complicated reading of the war. So it's very contradictory because you look at these little, you go to the individual exhibitions within the larger exhibition, and there's really interesting stuff, and it's complicated, and the objects are really interpreted. It's not banal. And so I don't know, you know, I think also in museums there's a lot of self-censorship. I mean, I think people, before somebody tells them they can't, they assume they can't. So the level at which that happened with this and not knowing how much Bering was going to push back could have had a big impact. And I don't really know, and I tried to get more information about his actual impact on the exhibition, and the party line that I got from a lot of different people was the title, the sweep, you know, and the curators kind of had the rest. So how that kind of, yeah.
It's tough. I mean, museums need money, as we know, and
Yeah.
certain donors, come with a heavier hand than others.
And Catherine Reynolds said, well, she said, I know you have to go out and get, earn money or find money for these exhibits, and I don't see people lining up out the door to pay for the kind of exhibits you want. So you may be leaving, you may be infuriated, but she sort of had that sour grapes attitude. I have the money and I'm willing to pay, and a lot of people left the institution, feeling like what else could they do? But some stayed and fight, and they're still in there kind of fighting for the kind of museum they want it to be. So it will be interesting when they reopen with all of these new exhibits, not all of which are funded by him or by Reynolds, to see if there's a kind of uniformity of this conservative turn, or to see if there are places where people are able to do what the not Abraham Lincoln only kind of history of American life that they came to that museum to do. So we'll have to.
I think it's obviously it's fine to do an exhibit about Abraham Lincoln, but you certainly want a somewhat sophisticated interpretation and not just the sort of heroic vision. I think that's what you're saying.
Yes. In fact, I have written ad infinitum about Abraham Lincoln, and I don't mean to imply at all that he's not important, but that Bering's gesture, this is about African-American migration, where's Abraham Lincoln, is the shorthand I was referring to.
Have you done any visitor studies to try to find out what people are really taking away from this?
I'm sure they will when they reopen. I wasn't able to get my hands on anything. David Allison, one of the curators, talked a lot about, in various things that I was able to get a hold of, about veterans and how much veterans liked it, which I thought was sort of an interesting, sort of a repetition of what was in what I'm arguing was in the content of the exhibit itself. Whose response is important? The veteran's response is important. And to a little bit of pushback he got about the Huey, he said, I had a veteran in here who pulled off his shirt and showed me he had a tattoo of the Huey right there on his body, and sort of, this is a beloved icon. This isn't a problematic icon. Using the veterans to make that argument. And I spent a fair amount of time in the exhibit sort of watching people move through. And it's a confusing exhibit. I would not at all be surprised if people came away with Price of Freedom, Soldiers Are Patriotic. I mean, the way that you move through the space and the intensity, the saturation of all of the music and colors and texts and objects, photographs, it's partly kind of where we are in terms of museum exhibition design at the moment. But the thing that I noticed, people kind of moving quickly and circling back around, sort of trying to figure out where to stop and read. And I think it was partly the problem of not having an intermediary narrative that people, okay, so what am I doing in this section? I'm in the Civil War. I've got some weapons. I have some stuff about slavery over here, but kind of how do I move through it? So that was my observation, and I don't know how much, I didn't get my hands on any of if they've done it, more systematic evaluation. Thank you all very much for coming.